The rain hammered against the windows of the old Brooklyn apartment like bullets against a shield. Steve Rogers sat alone in the darkness, his enhanced hearing picking up every drop that struck the glass. The super soldier serum had given him many gifts, but tonight he wished it could silence the memories that crashed through his mind with the same relentless force as the storm outside. His fingers traced the edges of a worn photograph. Even in the dim light, he could make out every detail of her face. Peggy Carter, the woman who had stolen his heart 70 years ago, only to slip through his fingers like sand when the ice claimed him. The woman he had loved, lost, and found again, only to watch time steal her away once more. The phone buzzed on the table beside him. Another mission briefing from Nick Fury. Another threat to world peace that required Captain America's attention. Steve almost ignored it, but duty had been burned into his soul long before the serum enhanced his body. He reached for the device, his massive hand dwarfing the small screen. Emergency situation developing in Eastern Europe. The message read, HYDRA cell has acquired stolen SHIELD technology. Immediate response required. Meet at the Triskelion at 0600. Steve closed his eyes and let out a long breath. Hydra, the organization that had haunted his entire existence, like a cancer that refused to die no matter how many times they cut it out. He had thought they were finished after the fall of SHIELD, but evil had a way of growing back stronger in the shadows. He stood and walked to the window, watching the rain create rivers down the glass. Somewhere out there, innocent people were sleeping peacefully in their beds, trusting that heroes like him would keep them safe. They didn't know that their protector was breaking apart inside, held together only by an unbreakable sense of duty and a shield made of vibranium. The truth was, Steve Rogers felt more alone now than he ever had as a skinny kid getting beaten up in Brooklyn alleys. At least then, he had Bucky, his best friend, his brother, the one person who understood him completely. But Bucky was gone too, lost to Hydra's twisted experiments and 70 years of brainwashing. The Winter Soldier had been a ghost haunting Steve's dreams, a reminder of everything he had failed to protect. He picked up his shield from where it leaned against the wall. The red, white, and blue surface reflected the lightning outside, and for a moment, Steve saw not Captain America, but the scared young man who had volunteered for an experimental procedure because he couldn't stand to watch bullies win. That man still lived inside him, still felt every loss like a physical wound that would never heal. The apartment felt suffocating suddenly. Steve grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. He needed air, needed movement, needed something to quiet the storm in his chest that matched the one outside. The streets of Brooklyn were empty except for the occasional taxi splashing through puddles. Steve walked without direction, his feet carrying him through neighborhoods that had changed beyond recognition. He found himself standing outside the old recruitment center where he had tried to enlist 5 times before Dr. Erskine finally gave him a chance. The building was different now, converted into a coffee shop with bright neon signs advertising specialty drinks. But Steve could still remember the weight of rejection, the burning desire to serve something greater than himself. You looking for something, Captain? Steve turned to find a young woman standing under a nearby awning, her scrub suggesting she was a nurse or doctor heading home from a late shift. She couldn't have been more than 25, with kind eyes that reminded him painfully of Peggy. Just remembering, Steve said, his voice rough with emotion. This neighborhood's full of ghosts, she replied, stepping closer. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old days, about heroes who came from these very streets. Steve nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The woman studied his face, recognition dawning in her expression. You're him, aren't you? Captain America. She didn't sound starstruck or excited, just sad. My grandmother was in London during the war. She said she met you once, at a hospital where she was volunteering. Said you sat with wounded soldiers all night, holding their hands while they died. The memory hit Steve like a physical blow. He remembered that night, remembered feeling helpless as brave young men slipped away despite all his enhanced abilities. He had learned then that being a super soldier meant carrying the weight of everyone he couldn't save. She's gone now, the woman continued. Cancer took her last month. But she always said the real heroes weren't the ones with superpowers. They were the ones who chose to care, even when it hurt. Steve looked at her, the stranger who seemed to understand his pain without knowing its source. I'm sorry for your loss, he managed, and I'm sorry for yours, she replied softly. Whatever it is you're carrying, Captain, don't carry it alone. Even heroes need someone to hold them up sometimes. She disappeared into the rain, leaving Steve standing alone with her words echoing in his mind. Tomorrow, he would face Dye again. He would fight battles that others couldn't, protect people who would never know his name. But tonight, for the first time in months, he didn't feel completely alone. The storm was beginning to pass. The Quinjet's engines hummed with deadly precision as Steve Rogers stared at the tactical display before him. 12 hours had passed since his encounter with the young nurse, but her words still echoed in his mind as he prepared to lead his team into another impossible situation. The HYDIA cell had fortified themselves in an abandoned Soviet facility deep in the Carpathian Mountains, and intelligence suggested they possessed technology that could shift the balance of global power. Target acquired. Captain, Natasha Romanov's voice crackled through the comm system. The Black Widow's tone was professional, but Steve caught the underlying concern. They had been working together long enough for him to read the subtle inflections in her voice. What are we looking at? Nat? Steve asked, moving to the cockpit where she sat piloting the aircraft through treacherous mountain terrain. 3-story concrete fortress, built into the mountainside. Thermal imaging shows at least 40 hostiles, but there could be more in the lower levels we can't scan. She pointed to the screen displaying the target location. The real problem is this energy signature coming from the basement. It's unlike anything I've seen before. Sam Wilson adjusted his wings and joined them at the display. Whatever they are powering down there, it's drawing massive amounts of electricity from the regional grid. Half of Romania's been experiencing rolling blackouts. Steve studied the fortress, his tactical mind automatically calculating angles of attack and potential casualties. But another part of him, the part that had been awakened by the nurse's words, wondered about the 40 people inside those walls. How many were true believers in Hydra's twisted ideology, and how many were simply desperate souls who had been recruited with promises of purpose and belonging? Intelligence reports suggest they are led by a man calling himself Baron Strucker, Steve said, reading from the briefing file. Apparently, his claim to be the heir to the original Baron's legacy. Another wannabe Nazi with daddy issues, Natasha muttered. How original. Don't underestimate him, Steve warned. Hydra's recruitment tactics have evolved. They are not just targeting the angry and disenfranchised anymore. They are finding people who have lost everything and offering them a family, a cause, a reason to keep living. Sam looked at him sharply. You sound like you understand the appeal. Steve was quiet for a moment, remembering his own desperate desire to belong to something greater than himself. I understand what it's like to be lost and looking for purpose. The difference is I found people who channel that need into something good. ETA 5 minutes to drop zone, Natasha announced. Final equipment check, gentlemen. Steve secured his shield and ran through his mental checklist. But as he prepared for battle, his mind drifted to a conversation he'd had with Bucky before his friend had been taken by HYD. They had been discussing their dreams for after the war, the lives they wanted to build when the fighting was over. Sometimes I think about just walking away from all this, Bucky had said, staring at the stars from their foxhole in the Italian countryside. Finding a quiet place where nobody knows our names, where we can just be regular people. You know we can't do that, Steve had replied. Not while there are still people who need protecting. I know, punk, but a guy can dream, can't he? Now, 70 years later, Steve realized that dream had died with his best friend. Even if he walked away from being Captain America, he would never be a regular person. The serum had made that impossible. But more than that, his own sense of responsibility had become a chain he could never break. 30 seconds to drop, Natasha called out. Steve stood and faced his team. Sam and Natasha were the closest things he had to family now, and the thought of leading them into danger filled him with a familiar dread. Every mission carried the possibility of loss, and Steve had already buried too many people he cared about. Listen to me, he said, his voice carrying the authority that came from leading soldiers into battle for over 7 decades. We go in fast and hard, but we go in smart. The objective is to secure whatever technology they've stolen and neutralize the threat. But I want everyone coming home tonight. That's not a request. That's an order. Yes, sir. Captain, Sam replied with a slight smile. Try to keep up, old man. Drop zone in sight, Natasha announced. Opening bay doors now. The howling wind filled the Quinjet as the rear door descended. Steve gripped his shield and looked out at the fortress below. Lights blazed from every window, and he could see guards patrolling the perimeter. They knew he was coming. HYDI always knew. For what it's worth, Natasha said, appearing beside him. That nurse was right. You don't have to carry everything alone. Steve glanced at her in surprise. You heard that conversation. I hear everything. Rogers. It's what I do. She secured her weapons and prepared to rappel down. The point is, we're not just your team. We're your friends. Start acting like it. Before Steve could respond, she had disappeared into the darkness below. Sam patted his shoulder and followed her down the rope. Steve took one last look at the photograph of Peggy he kept tucked inside his uniform, then secured it carefully against his heart. The fortress waited below, filled with enemies who would show no mercy. But for the first time in months, Steve Rogers felt like he wasn't facing them alone. He gripped the rope and descended into the night, his shield catching the moonlight like a promise of justice. The battle for Hydra's secret would determine more than just the fate of their stolen technology. Tonight would test whether Captain America could learn to trust his friends with a weight he had been carrying alone for too long. As his feet touched the ground and gunfire erupted around him, Steve raised his shield and charged forward into the storm of war. The first wave of HYDRA agents fell like wheat before a side of Steve's shield carved through a defensive line. But something was wrong. These weren't the fanatical soldiers he expected. As he fought his way through the fortress corridors, Steve noticed hesitation in their attacks, fear in their eyes that went beyond normal battle terror. Cap, you seeing this? Sam's voice crackled through the calm as his wings carried him through the upper levels. These guys are fighting like they are scared of something other than us. I noticed, Steve replied, deflecting automatic weapons fire with his shield. They keep looking over their shoulders. Natasha's voice cut through the chatter. I'm picking up some kind of audio transmission on the lower frequencies. It's disturbing. Sounds like screaming, but it's been altered somehow. Steve felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. HYDI had always been willing to experiment on human subjects, but something about this felt different, more personal. He fought his way deeper into the facility, following the energy readings that led toward the basement levels. The corridors grew narrower as he descended, and the walls changed from concrete to reinforced metal. Strange symbols were etched into the surfaces, not the typical HYDI octopus logo, but something older, more primitive. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and something else Steve couldn't identify. I'm at the main laboratory, Steve reported, standing before a massive steel door marked with warnings in multiple languages. The energy readings are off the charts in here. Steve, wait for backup. Natasha's voice carried urgency. Something's not right about this place. But Steve was already opening the door, his shield raised defensively. What he saw inside made his enhanced metabolism skip a beat. The laboratory was filled with tanks of glowing blue fluid, each one containing a human figure suspended in artificial sleep. Dozens of them, men and women of various ages, all connected to a central machine that pulsed with the same blue light. My God, he whispered, stepping closer to examine the nearest tank. The person inside was young, maybe 18, with dark hair that floated around a peaceful face. But there was something wrong with the readings on the tank's display. The neural activity patterns were chaotic, like a storm raging inside the subject's mind. Welcome, Captain Rogers. Steve spun toward the voice, his shield ready. A tall man in an expensive suit stood at the far end of the laboratory, his hands clasped behind his back. He was younger than the original Baron Strucker, but carried the same arrogant bearing that Steve remembered from the war. I am Baron Helmut Strucker, heir to my grandfather's vision, the man continued. And you are just in time to witness the culmination of decades of research. What are you doing to these people? Steve demanded, his voice tight with controlled rage. Perfecting them, Strucker replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. HYDRA has always sought to create the perfect soldier, but we learned from our mistakes with the Winter Soldier program. Instead of breaking minds, we're rewriting them completely. Steve's blood turned to ice. Bucky. Ah, yes, the famous James Buchanan Barnes. His torment inspired this entire project. You see, Captain, we discovered that a broken mind never fully heals. It always remembers, always fights back. But a mind that has been completely rewritten, rebuilt from the ground up with new memories, new loyalties, new purposes, that is truly ours. The implications hit Steve like a physical blow. These weren't prisoners or volunteers. They were people who had been kidnapped and had their entire identities erased, replaced with false memories and programmed loyalty to HY Day. The beautiful irony, Strucker continued, is that each of these subjects believes they joined HY Day willingly. They have memories of recruitment, of choosing our cause, of finding family and purpose with us. They will fight and die for us with complete conviction because they truly believe we saved them from empty lives. You're creating slaves who think they're free, Steve said, his shield arm trembling with rage. I'm creating believers, Captain, true believers who will never question, never doubt, never betray us because HY Die is literally all they know. Strucker gestured to a control panel. And the best part? The technology we're using was stolen from SHIELD's own memory reconstruction projects. Your organization helped us perfect the process. Steve stepped forward, but Strucker held up a warning hand. I wouldn't, if I were you. This entire laboratory is rigged with explosives. One wrong move, and all of these innocent subjects die. Not that they're innocent anymore, of course. We've already begun the integration process for most of them. What do you want? Steve asked, though he already knew the answer. Your surrender, naturally. The great Captain America, submitting to the same process as these lesser subjects. Imagine the propaganda value. Imagine the symbol you would become for our cause. Strucker's eyes gleamed with fanatic fervor. Steve Rogers, true believer, leading Hydra's armies with the same conviction you once brought to fighting us. Steve thought about the young nurse he had met the night before, about her grandmother who had volunteered in London during the war. He thought about all the people sleeping peacefully in their beds, trusting that heroes would keep them safe. And he thought about Bucky, tortured and broken by decades of mental manipulation. There's just one problem with your plan, Steve said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. And what's that? I already know who I am. Steve hurled his shield with perfect precision, not at Strucker, but at the central machine controlling the memory reconstruction process. The vibranium disc tore through cables and circuits, sending sparks cascading through the laboratory. Alarms began blaring as the tank started to drain. The subject inside began to stir, their natural memories fighting to reassert themselves as the artificial programming failed. You've doomed them all. Strucker screamed, reaching for a detonator. They'll remember what we did to them. They'll remember being taken, being violated. You're condemning them to madness. I'm giving them back their choice, Steve replied, catching his shield as it ricocheted back to him. Whatever pain they face, it will be their own pain, not your lie. Strucker's finger moved toward the detonator button, but Natasha's widow's bite hit him from behind, dropping him unconscious to the floor. She and Sam appeared at the laboratory entrance, having fought their way through the remaining HY Die forces. Evacuation protocols are in place, Natasha reported. Medical teams are standing by for the subjects. Steve looked at the tanks as people began to wake up, confusion and terror written on their faces as their real memories returned. It would be a long, painful process of healing for all of them, but they would heal as themselves, not as Hydra's puppets. Sometimes the hardest thing about being a hero, Sam said quietly, is knowing that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. Steve nodded, watching as the first subject was helped from their tank by a medic. The person was crying, but they were crying with their own tears, feeling their own pain. In a world of lies and manipulation, that truth was worth fighting for. Come on, he said to his team. Let's go home. The SHIELD medical facility hummed with quiet activity as Steve walked through corridors filled with recovering victims. 3 weeks had passed since the HY Die operation, and the rescued subject was slowly reclaiming their stolen lives. Steve made these visits daily, unable to shake the feeling that he owed them something more than just their freedom. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead psychologist overseeing their recovery, met him at the main desk. Her tired eyes reflected the emotional weight of helping people rebuild shattered identities. How are they progressing? Steve asked, though he dreaded the answer. It's complicated, Dr. Chen replied, leading him down the hallway. The memory reconstruction process was more sophisticated than anything we've encountered. Some patients are recovering quickly, their original personalities reasserting themselves. Others are struggling with severe dissociation and identity confusion. They stopped outside a room where a young man sat staring out the window. Steve recognized him as the 18-year-old from the first tank he had seen in the laboratory. That's Marcus Rivera, Dr. Chen explained quietly. He was taken 6 months ago after his family died in a car accident. HYDRA gave him memories of joining them voluntarily, seeking purpose after his loss. Now he remembers both the false memories and the real trauma. He is having difficulty distinguishing between what actually happened to him and what was programmed. Steve watched the young man's face, seeing his own pain reflected there. Can I talk to him? Dr. Chen hesitated. He's been asking about you specifically. He remembers you destroying the machine that was controlling him, but he also has programmed memories of you as Hydra's enemy. It's creating significant cognitive conflict. Maybe that's exactly what he needs, Steve said. Someone who understands living with conflicting memories. Dr. Chen nodded reluctantly and opened the door. Marcus looked up as Steve entered, his eyes showing a mixture of recognition, confusion, and something that might have been hope. You're Captain America, Marcus said, his voice uncertain. But you're also the man who saved me. That doesn't make sense according to what I remember. Steve pulled up a chair and sat down across from the young man. What do you remember? 2 different lives, Marcus replied, his hands trembling slightly. In one, I lost my family and fell into despair until HYDI found me and gave me purpose. In the other, I lost my family and was kidnapped by monsters who violated my mind. Both memories feel completely real. They are both real, Steve said gently. The pain of losing your family is real. The despair you felt is real. But the part about choosing HYD, about finding purpose with them, that was artificial. They took your real pain and used it to create a lie. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. How do you tell the difference between what's real and what isn't when everything hurts the same way? The question hit Steve harder than he expected. How many nights had he lain awake wondering if his memories of Peggy were accurate, or if time and loss had painted them in colors that never existed? How many times had he questioned whether his friendship with Bucky was as strong as he remembered, or if his guilt over losing him had made him romanticize their bond? I don't think you can, Steve admitted. Not completely, but maybe that's not the right question to ask. Marcus looked up, confused. Maybe the question isn't which memories are real, Steve continued. Maybe it's which memories you choose to build your future on. The pain of losing your family, that's something you can honor by living a life they would be proud of. The anger HYDA tried to program into you, that's something you can choose to let go. But what if I'm making the wrong choice? Marcus asked. What if I choose to trust the wrong memories? Steve thought about the young nurse who had found him in the rain, about her grandmother who had learned that heroes weren't the ones with superpowers, but the ones who chose to care even when it hurt. Then you'll make mistakes, Steve said. You'll trust the wrong people sometimes, or believe things that aren't true. But you'll be making those mistakes as yourself, not as someone else's puppet. And that's what makes you human. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Chen entered with a tablet in her hands, her expression troubled. Captain, I need to show you something, she said. We've been analyzing the neural patterns of all the recovered subjects, and we found something unexpected. Steve followed her to a private office where she displayed brain scans on a large monitor. Look at this, she said, pointing to areas of unusual activity. Every single subject shows evidence of enhanced neural pathways in regions associated with empathy, emotional intelligence, and moral reasoning. It's as if the process that was meant to erase their identities actually strengthened their capacity for human connection. Steve studied the scans, not understanding the medical implications, but recognizing something profound was being revealed. What does that mean? He asked. It means Hydra's attempt to create perfect soldiers backfired, Dr. Chen explained. Instead of making them more compliant, the process appears to have made them more human. more capable of recognizing suffering in others, more driven to help and protect. It's like their souls fought back against the programming by becoming more compassionate. Steve felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the guilt he had carried since the rescue operation. These people hadn't just been saved from Hydra's control. They had been transformed by their own resilience into something stronger than what they were before. "There's more," Dr. Chen continued. "Marcus and several other subjects have requested to speak with you about something. They wouldn't tell me what it is, but they seem to have reached some kind of decision together." Steve returned to Marcus's room to find it filled with other recovering subjects, men and women of different ages and backgrounds, all showing signs of the difficult healing process, but all displaying something Steve recognized as determination. "Captain Rogers," Marcus said, standing to face him. "We've been talking, all of us who were in those tanks. We remember what HY did to us, and we remember why they thought we would make good soldiers." A woman in her 30s stepped forward. "They targeted people who had lost everything, people who were looking for purpose and belonging. They thought that made us weak, vulnerable to their programming." "But they were wrong," said an older man with gray hair. "Losing everything didn't make us weak. It taught us how precious everything is. It taught us what's worth fighting for." Marcus looked directly at Steve. "We want to help, not as soldiers, but as people who understand what it's like to have your identity stolen. There are others out there, people HY is targeting right now, people who are lost and looking for purpose. We want to find them first," the woman added, "not to recruit them for some cause, but to offer them what HY never could. Real connection, real purpose, real choice." Steve looked around the room at these survivors, these people who had been broken and rebuilt themselves into something stronger. They weren't asking to be heroes. They were asking for the chance to heal others the way they had been healed. "What do you need from me?" Steve asked. "Just what you gave us in that laboratory," Marcus replied. "The truth, and the freedom to choose what to do with it." As Steve left the facility that evening, he realized that the nurse had been wrong about one thing. Heroes weren't just the ones who chose to care even when it hurt. Sometimes, heroes were the ones who had been hurt the most and chose to care anyway. The real victory against HY wasn't destroying their machines or defeating their soldiers. It was proving that the human spirit couldn't be programmed, couldn't be controlled, couldn't be broken no matter how sophisticated the methods used against it. In trying to create perfect soldiers, HY had accidentally created perfect examples of humanity's greatest strength. The ability to transform suffering into compassion, loss into purpose, and pain into the motivation to ensure others never had to suffer the same way. Steve walked into the night with his shield on his back and hope in his heart, knowing that the fight would continue, but also knowing he wasn't fighting it alone. 6 months later, Steve Rogers stood in the same Brooklyn apartment where this journey had begun, but everything had changed. Rain still drummed against the windows, but now it sounded like applause rather than bullets. The darkness that once felt suffocating now felt peaceful, a comfortable quiet that comes when you finally stop fighting yourself. On the table beside him lay a letter, handwritten on cream-colored paper. It had arrived that morning from a small town in Ohio, one of dozens he received weekly from the people they now called the Reclaimed. Marcus Rivera had written it, updating Steve on the community center he had opened for at-risk youth, funded by a grateful government and staffed by other HY survivors who had transformed their trauma into purpose. "Captain," the letter read, "you taught me that the question isn't which memories to trust, but which ones to build on. I'm building on the memory of you walking into that laboratory and choosing to free us, even knowing it would cause us pain. That's the kind of person I want to be. Someone who chooses difficult truth over comfortable lies." Steve set the letter down and walked to the window. Across the street, he could see lights in apartment windows, families gathered around dinner tables, children doing homework, ordinary people living ordinary lives made possible by those willing to carry extraordinary burdens. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that burden felt shared. His phone buzzed with a text from Natasha. "Movie night at the compound. Sam picked something called The Princess Bride. Apparently, it's required viewing for friendship. Your attendance is mandatory." Steve smiled, recognizing the warmth behind her casual tone. The walls he had built around himself were slowly crumbling. Not through force, but through the patient friendship of people who refuse to let him carry his pain alone. Another message appeared, this one from Sam. Fair warning, we're also having the Steve needs to start dating conversation tonight. Nat found some kind of app that matches people based on shared trauma. It's either brilliant or terrifying. Before Steve could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. He answered cautiously. Captain Rogers, this is Dr. Elizabeth Manning from Brooklyn General Hospital. The voice was professional but tinged with emotion. I'm calling about a patient who's been asking for you specifically. She says she met you a few months ago outside a coffee shop. Steve's chest tightened. The nurse, is she all right? She's dying, Captain. Cancer, like her grandmother. She doesn't have family, and she's been alone through most of her treatment. She asked me to call because she said you might understand what it's like to face the end without people who knew you when you were whole. The words hit Steve like a physical blow. This woman who had offered him comfort in his darkest moment was now facing her own darkness, and she had reached out to him not as Captain America, but as someone who understood loneliness. I'll be right there, Steve said, already reaching for his jacket. Captain, Dr. Manning continued, she wants you to know that you don't have to come as a hero. She just wants you to come as Steve. 20 minutes later, Steve sat beside a hospital bed holding the hand of a woman whose name he had never learned. She looked smaller than he remembered, diminished by illness but not defeated. Her eyes still held the same kindness that had stopped him on that rainy night. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said, her voice weak but steady. You helped save my life that night, Steve replied. I couldn't save my best friend, couldn't save the woman I loved, couldn't save countless people who depended on me. But maybe I can sit with you now. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. My name is Sarah. Sarah Walsh. I wanted you to know that before. It's nice to meet you, Sarah, Steve said, and meant it. I've been thinking about what I told you that night, she continued, about not carrying things alone. I realized I was being hypocritical. I've been carrying my diagnosis alone for months, pushing away friends, refusing help. Why? Steve asked gently. Because I didn't want to be a burden. Didn't want people's last memories of me to be of sickness and sadness. She looked at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. But you can't protect people from caring about you by pushing them away. You just rob them of the chance to show love when it matters most. Steve felt tears he hadn't shed in decades building behind his eyes. I've spent so long trying to be strong enough to protect everyone that I forgot to let anyone protect me. That's the thing about real strength, Sarah said. It's not about carrying everything alone. It's about building connections strong enough to share the weight. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city lights twinkle through the hospital window. Steve found himself talking about things he had never shared with anyone, his fear that he had failed everyone who mattered to him, his guilt over surviving when so many others hadn't, his terror that the serum had made him something less human rather than something more. You know what I think, Sarah said when he finished. I think you're exactly who you're supposed to be. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but human enough to feel pain and strong enough to keep caring anyway. How do you do it? Steve asked, face the end with such peace. Sarah smiled, and for a moment she looked like the young woman who had found him in the rain. Because I'm not facing it alone. I have you here with me now. I have the memory of my grandmother's love. I have the knowledge that my work as a nurse helped people, that my life mattered. She paused, her breathing becoming more labored. And because I know that the connections we make, the love we share, the way we change each other's lives, that doesn't end when our bodies do. You'll carry something of me forward, just like you carry pieces of everyone you've ever loved. As dawn broke over Brooklyn, Sarah Walsh closed her eyes for the last time, her hand still clasped in Steve's. But she didn't die alone, and neither did the part of Steve Rogers that had been slowly dying since he emerged from the ice 70 years ago. When Steve finally left the hospital, he found Natasha and Sam waiting in the parking lot. They didn't ask questions or offer empty platitudes. They simply walked beside him as he made his way back into the world. Two friends who understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is your presence in their pain. So, Sam said eventually, breaking the reverent silence, are we still doing movie night? Actually, Steve replied, pulling out his phone to look at the messages from Marcus and dozens of other reclaimed survivors. I was thinking we could visit the community center in Ohio this weekend. There are some people I'd like you to meet. Natasha smiled. Sound perfect. Road trip it is. As they walked through the streets of Brooklyn together, Steve realized that Sarah had given him one final gift. She had shown him that love doesn't end with loss, that connections transcend death, and that the greatest victory against loneliness isn't finding someone to complete you, but building a community of people willing to stand with you in both triumph and sorrow. The shield on his back felt lighter than it had in years, not because his responsibilities had diminished, but because he finally understood that carrying the burden of protecting others didn't mean carrying it alone. Steve Rogers had learned to be Captain America. Now, surrounded by friends and connected to a growing network of people who had chosen healing over hatred, he was finally learning to be human. And in a world that often seemed determined to tear itself apart, that might be the most heroic thing of all. The rain had stopped, and the sun was shining.